Okay, I'm going to give another 2 minutes for people to join in. Okay. And then I'm going to kick start. Looks like people are joining. Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to the South Africa Climate Action Network NDC webinar. The title of our webinar today is The Future of Proof Climate Commitments. And the big question that we have is South Africa ambitious enough? We all know that in advance to the COP21 in Paris in 2015, South Africa submitted its intended national determined combination to the UNFCCC. And today we hope to bring together a webinar where we can have a look as to where we stand as parties of the UNFCCC's COP summit and their revised commitments to reversing anthropogenic climate change. We have a range of amazing panelists, and we have a panelist that will give perspective from parties around the globe who have already submitted their NDC. Then we'll take a glance to South Africa's revised NDC that has been revised on the 31st of March, 2021, and the stakeholder engagement that is commenced to start in April. Finally, and not least, we'll have a look at civil society as to what it has done in its own analysis of what is required by South Africa to remain on target. And so to start off our panel discussion, the first question that we have is, as COP26 president, the UK has immense pressure to put together a successful COP26 and also to lay a strong foundation for an ambitious climate action for the upcoming years. So what role do NDCs play to this end? And what kind of activities is the COP26 presidency to ensure that we have this result? And to introduce us and to discuss this with us, I would like to introduce Mr. John Wade Smith, who works at the British High Commission as the regional lead. Just a brief bio of Mr. John Smith. He is an experienced diplomat for over 30 years, working experience with an international career that has a strong African focus. Previously, he worked in development in Kenya, such as the Deputy High Commissioner in Botswana, and previously in South Africa from 2008 to 2012. This was work leading to climate and energy work for the British High Commission in the run to the COP26 in Durban. After a 3.5-year span, John returned to South Africa to be a regional lead for the UK Science and Innovation before setting up a new climate and energy team in Pretoria in 2019. John, it is such a pleasure to have you. And we hope today you can help us really answer what are the things that we need to do, or what is the things that the presidency needs to do to ensure that we have these kind of results.
Fantastic. And Ndoni, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay. Thank you very much for that introduction. Let me just set a bit of context. I mean, for me, it's a delight to be back in South Africa again. As Ndoni mentioned, I had been the head of climate in South Africa in 2008, 2012, leading up to Durban Conference, South Africa's own Africa COP, which was an extraordinary ride for me, incredibly great learning experience, and a wonderful experience in Durban. And I think South Africa still quite rightly gets lots of plaudits for the role it did in pulling the world together and making sure COP17 was a success and led on to where we are today. So I was asked about what role do NDCs play and what kind of activities does the COP presidency involve itself in to ensure the result of this is important. Let me just set very briefly the context again, which is that in 2015, 5.5 years ago now, the world came together and took another step in the recognition, not only of the scale, but also of the pace of the crisis we're facing, the climate crisis we're facing, in agreeing the Paris commitment. And the central aim of the Paris commitment on mitigation goal was that we needed to keep the world's global temperature to well below 2 degrees and to strive to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. And that is based on the science and the risk that is associated with any slippage or failure to reach those targets. And that's really important to bear in mind when we start talking about the importance of the NDC. As COP president, can I also underline the fact that people often, I think, criticize quite rightly or question whether or not mitigation is the only priority for many in the developed world or developed economies. The answer is absolutely not. The Paris Agreement made it very clear that there are 3 pillars. There's mitigation, but we need to strengthen adaptation and resilience to impacts, and we need to scale up support and finance that protects and restores nature and empowers inclusive action. And these are 3 pillars that we as COP president are determined that we will be giving equal priority to as we take our work forward to Glasgow. But it is clear that if we don't get the mitigation targets right, if we don't pull the global action on a pathway that leads us to well below 2 degrees and close to limiting at 1.5 degrees, we're not going to have sufficient money or the adaptive capacity to manage what the science tells us are the implications of climate impacts beyond 2 degrees. So getting the mitigation story is essential. I just think then in terms of that, what else did Paris say about mitigation? It was that there's a legally binding requirement for all signatories to prepare and communicate updated NDCs every 5 years. And the NDC, it needs to be important to remind, it is the clear statement by a party to the convention of its intent in terms of its contribution, its ambition in terms of changing the profile, its emission profile of the country as its contribution, its fair and equitable contribution to the global task of reducing emissions down to the levels that gives us a chance of some sustainability. And by submitting NDCs, there are 2 things that we can do with them. One is, by definition, you can compare and contrast, and you can look and compare different countries and make assessments about whether or not they meet the kind of standards that are required. But also, we can combine them together. And in taking them together, we can take a snapshot and look at what's been offered collectively and determine whether or not this is actually setting us on the pathway to the targets we set in Paris. And so for us, COP26 is incredibly important. It's the first time after Paris that we will have that moment where everyone will bring together a revised or an updated NDC, and we can collectively review them and take stock. And our intention is very much that we want to see Glasgow as a moment when we can confirm and demonstrate to the world, the public, who will be watching very closely, that at this key juncture, we are now actually on the right path towards securing a future for our children and the sort of following generations. And we are very clear that a bold NDC with high ambition does 2 fundamental things. Not 3. It contributes to the global whole, which I think is important, but also it sets a clear political signal, be it an emerging, a least developed, or an emerged economy. It sets a clear signal to all other parties about their intent, and also pressure to raise everyone else's game as well. And also a high ambition NDC speaks to the innovation, the industrial, the investor community of where the government is determined their country will go. And that's incredibly important. I think it's also important for South Africa to reflect on that, because, you know, the way in which the finance is going, and the way in which we are increasingly looking at driving a low carbon global future. So where does South Africa want to be on that pathway as we look in the next 10, 20, 30 years, at the forefront or playing a form of catch up? And that's where the NDC is an interesting snapshot about the intent today. But obviously NDCs are able to be revised every 5 years or regularly. But it is an important moment to set out where South Africa sees its trajectory. So I was also then asked what the UK role was. So I think from our perspective, and I think you'll hear this very clearly from Claire from the Climate Action Tracker, that there remains an ambition gap. So 2015, we identified the challenge, what we do. As of right now, we're still not there. And you know, the public concern is that we need to see a much greater response than we've got right now. So our role as the incoming president is to kind of set that narrative, to help shape expectations, but also to try and build that pressure for countries to come forward with ambition before COP26. And therefore, we're aiming that every country will come back with a new, more ambitious update in terms of their activities over the next 10 up to 2030. But again, also for us, it's very important not to lose sight. The NDC is often seen as the target or the activity of the next 10 years, not to lose sight of what the longer term context is, which is the net zero we're trying to achieve, and therefore link that to a long range target, a 2050 target. So what have we been doing? So over the last year, we had a slightly difficult year globally. I mean, a terrible year globally, economically and health-wise through COVID, but obviously it had an impact on the COP26, which had to be deferred for a year. So right now, we should be talking about what the collective ambition had been and where do we take it further forward. But we're still talking about what we might be able to deliver by COP26. So last year, we've been driving a number of major sort of international campaigns. And I've talked about the adaptation, which is incredibly important. And finance is absolutely core to us. We need developed worlds to step up and deliver against the 100 billion a year target that was set, and also have a clear foundation for a conversation which sets out what the new levels need to be as we go forward. And so that's very much something we're driving. But linked to the sort of the issues around NDCs and mitigation, we're running a couple of other campaigns looking at energy. In order for us to meet the Paris goals, we need global transition to clean power to be about 4 times faster than it currently is at present. So there's a very strong push from us to try and re-energize the ambition globally around grasping the opportunities that now exist with the price differentials on renewable energy, and move into that as quick as possible to help energy be a major contributor to our global ambition. And transport. The world will get moving again after a year of COVID. And we need to double the pace that global transition to zero emission vehicles takes place. I think there's an estimate that to meet the Paris Agreement, 100% of all new car sales need to be zero emissions by 2040. In the UK, we've made it clear that there will be no new cars sold in the UK from 2030 onwards that have the internal combustion engine. So we're continuing those things, but given the fact that COP26 was delayed by a year, we were very conscious that we needed to have a moment at the end of last year which ensured that momentum was not lost. The year might be deferred, but the activity and the pace that cannot change. So we, together with France and co-hosted or in partnership with Chile and Italy and the UN Secretary General, we held a Climate Ambition Summit where we encouraged the world to come together to use that as another moment to push forward the fact that we bought into the need for real ambition. At that 40, there were 90 countries took part in it. And this is very important to set the context within South Africa and more globally about what is the global trajectory. 90 countries turned up, 75 world leaders set out new ambition. And in December, 45 countries, 45 leaders highlighted new and more ambitious NDCs, which actually covers 71 countries because the EU puts forward one consolidated offer, but obviously that captures 27 countries. And 20 other countries spoke about new or forthcoming adaptation commitments. So what was impressive, I think, is just at that summit, or just before that summit, and that included countries like China, South Korea, Japan. It means that countries representing about 65% of the global CO2 emissions and around 70% of the world's economy have now committed to reaching net zero or carbon neutrality. So that's an important moment, but it's not enough. I think we simply push for greater ambition, and we'll hear about that later from other presentations. And the one other thing, of course, that the UK needs to be doing to try and drive this is that we need to lead by example. We cannot be pressing these messages without us being able to demonstrate that we fully embrace it and we're in the forefront. So in December at that Ambition Summit, we set out our NDC, which we can go into a bit more detail later on if you like. But I think the headlines, which are really important, is that we have committed ourselves that we will reduce our emissions by at least 68% on 1990 levels by 2030. And in addition to that, we've enshrined in law our commitment to net zero by 2050. And the 2030 target commits the UK to the fastest rate of emissions reductions of any major economy. So we can discuss if necessary, or if people are interested, about how we're going about it and why. But that was a very important moment for us to set forward that we are leading by example and putting our money where our mouth is. On the finance issue, again, we have retained and committed to doubling our contribution to global international climate finance to 11.6 billion over the next 5-year period. So on both our commitment to finance, but also more important, our own domestic agenda, we're trying to lead by example. So I'm just going to wrap up now because I'm going to hear much more interesting in presentations, much more specific information. But I think that the summation from us as COP president is that at Glasgow, we need to show that the clean, the low carbon growth is the story of the future, that it is accelerating and that it is irreversible, and that our path to zero carbon economy must be fair and it must be inclusive and it must create the global resilience that we need to combat climate change. And Ndoni, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that amazing presentation, John. I'm not going to lie to you. I clearly heard your passion for Africa in your conversation, which is really rare to hear in international discussions. The key points that I really got from you from your talk was, one, we need to focus on our adaptation. Number two, our finances, and really commit to the goal that we already have for the COP26. And number three, we need to actually set these conversations to be open and fair and just and inclusive of everyone when it comes to the COP26 and reducing our emissions. Thank you so much, John. Please post your question on the question and answers on the chat, and let us engage further on how we can actually, incorporate this co-development between international and locals for a better COP26 conference and reducing our emissions. With that said, I would like to move on to our next topic and our next panelist. So the next panelist, what we really need to understand, we need a brief of any analytical work that has been done on the NDC submitted globally, the extent of the emission gap, the shortcomings, and what is needed by parties, particularly those who are yet to submit their NDC. And to do this and to help us get and pave the way in this is none other than Claire Stockwell. And a brief bio on Claire Stockwell. She is a senior climate policy analyst with the Climate Analytics, one of the two organizations behind Climate Action Tracker. Her work focuses on CAT's country analysis and its climate governance series. Prior to joining Climate Analytics, Claire worked as a consultant. She has many years of experience in climate law and policy, including attending the climate negotiations for over a decade. Welcome, Claire, and thank you for being here today. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ndoni, and good morning, everyone. Very nice to be with you, and hello from Berlin, which is where I'm coming from, broadcasting this presentation this morning. It's very nice to be with you, and thank you very much for the invitation to present. So yes, as Ndoni said, I am with the Climate Action Tracker, which is a consortium of two organizations, Climate Analytics and our partner, the New Climate Institute. And one of the, I think we do many things here at the Climate Action Tracker, but one of the things that we're probably most well known for is we rate countries' NDCs. So we rate countries' the climate targets that they have adopted and submitted to the UN. And we also assess what that means in terms of end of century warming and the emissions gap that we're going to face in the near term in 2030. So what I was hoping to do today was give to you a very brief overview of sort of where we stand with the NDCs at the moment, what that means in terms of end of century warming, and then also what we need to do by the time we get to Glasgow. Now, John gave you a really great overview of sort of where things are, and I guess the couple of points I just wanted to reiterate was first, that the NDCs are not just about cutting emissions, they are broader than that, but the focus of the Climate Action Tracker is really on mitigation, so that's where I'm going to focus my remarks this morning. And then also the idea that, when we were in Paris 5 years, or more than 5 years ago now, in 2015, it was recognized then that the targets that were on the table were insufficient and that we would need to come back and ratchet these up over time. So now we're really in that first cycle of increasing ambitions. It was supposed to be done by the end of last year, but obviously the pandemic has delayed things. But that's really important because we knew back then we weren't on track to reach the 1.5 Paris degree limit, and we really need to close that gap. So with that, where do we stand at the moment? And what I've put up here is just a screenshot. If you go to our website, we have a page that's dedicated to tracking to which countries have submitted updated NDCs. I should also say that in the Climate Action Tracker, unfortunately, we can't track all countries. So we focus on about 40 countries, including the EU, that includes all of the major emitters, as well as about 80% of global emissions. So for those countries that we track regularly, when they submit their new NDCs, we try and do a very rapid assessment and get that up on our website to figure out, is it a stronger target, or a weaker target? Where have they made improvements in that, and get that analysis out there as quickly as possible. What you can see from this graph, though, unfortunately, is where we stand now. We still have only about 40% of global countries representing about 40% of global emissions have submitted NDC updates. And so you can see there's lots of light gray on that map, which shows that countries either haven't submitted or haven't even announced or proposed targets that they would be submitting. And within the category that have submitted, not all of them, unfortunately, have made improvements. So I've put up a list in those that we track regularly. There's about 10 countries that have submitted so far that have made no improvements in their NDCs. And in some cases, they've actually gone back. So unfortunately, in the case of Brazil, Mexico, they submitted the same numerical targets as their first, as they did in Paris, but because of changes that they've made to the baseline, those targets are actually weaker than what they were when the Paris Agreement was first adopted. Russia is another example, though its targets on paper are stronger. When we compare that to where the country is in terms of its actual emissions trajectory, it can easily meet those targets with current ambition, and so or with current policies that it's got in place. So it could really go much stronger. Australia is also an example of a country that just resubmitted its old NDC targets. Now, there are some on this list that we do well. All of them on the list we hope will reconsider over the course of this year going into COP26, and they do have the opportunity to strengthen those further. So I've got Japan and New Zealand at the bottom there. They also submitted their targets last year, the old targets, but we do really think that there's a strong possibility that they could be resubmitting updated targets this year, and Japan could make some announcements in the very near future. There are, I'm happy to report, though, some countries that have been taking action and have been updating their targets and submitting or proposing stronger targets this year. So I guess the one that I would point out that was also mentioned earlier is the EU at the tail end of last year submitted its revised target, so it would go to a 55% reduction below 1990 levels, which is definitely a step in the right direction, but in terms of, it's not quite there of what we would need to see from the EU in terms of being Paris compatible. I think for that you'd need closer to a domestic target in the sort of 58 to 70% range for the EU to really be 1.5 degree compatible, but at least we did see a stronger target out of the EU. I know others on this panel are going to speak in a lot more detail to the South African draft, but I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention our assessment, and I would encourage you to visit our website to read a little bit more. We did look at the draft when it was released a couple of weeks ago, and what we find is that by lowering the upper end of the range, South Africa improves in our rating system by 1 category. However, that upper end of the range is still insufficient to reach 1.5 degree compatibility. If we were instead to look at the bottom end of that range, that was unchanged from the first NDC, and that's still sort of sitting in the 2 degrees compatibility range in our assessment category, but you know, still not quite in the 1.5 degree compatible category. So that was just a very quick overview of where we stand in terms of submissions. And clearly we've got a lot of countries still needing to submit by the end of the year, and those that haven't submitted, that have submitted old targets or weaker targets or targets that weren't 1.5 degree compatible, still have the opportunity in the rest of this year to come up with stronger targets and submit those before Glasgow. But where does that leave us in terms of what we do have on the table now, in terms of the NDCs? Where does that leave us in terms of end of century warming? And I should caveat this a little bit with the temperature thermometer that I'm showing you there has, this was the analysis that we did in last December. So John mentioned at the top there was the Climate Ambition Summit in December, and there were a number of NDC announcements there. That is not yet reflected in the figures that I'm showing to you here, but I think the general message still stands, which is that clearly the NDCs that are on the table at the moment are not sufficient to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. In fact, they would put us more at about 2.6 degrees by end of century warming. And the picture is even more alarming if we turn not just from the targets that governments have put on the table, but look at really what are the policies in place now to reduce emissions. And if we look at those policies and the policies that are being implemented, it would actually lead us to close to 3 degrees of warming. So not only do we have a target gap that we need to strengthen those targets and where countries are headed, we also need to strengthen the ambition piece to make sure that those targets are actually met. Now, if I switch instead to look at, so that was the sort of temperature piece. If we look at it from an emissions perspective, you can also see that we have in this near term, so where do we need to be in terms of 2030 global emissions? There we still have a huge emissions gap. So this again is from our assessment pre the December summit, so it's not the most up-to-date figures there, but we are showing a 23 to 27 gigaton gap in terms of emissions, where emissions would need to be in 2030 to put us on the world on track to 1.5 degrees. We have done a sort of rough calculation to figure out, keeping in mind the EU target that has been announced, the backsliding from Brazil and others, how that would change this picture. And we think that that's in the ballpark of about 1 gigaton closing the gap. So even with the announcement that we've had in December, we would still have a very significant gap in 2030 in terms of where emissions need to be if we're serious about limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. So that we will be that's where we stand now. we do see opportunities on the horizon for ambitious action and hopefully new updates. And the one that's sort of coming up next week, which some of you may have heard of, is the US is organizing a climate leaders summit and has invited 40 world leaders to come together on Earth Day to talk about climate ambition. We would, or we are anticipating that before or at that event, the United States is going to announce its new climate target. And really there for climate leadership, we would expect in terms of domestic emissions that the US target would need to be in the sort of 57 to 63% range for that to be that's what its domestic target would need to be to put it on a 1.5 degree category. We've also seen, and we would hopefully anticipate that there would be a number of announcements from other countries either at or around this summit. We will be, just as a sort of information point, we will be updating our analysis after this summit to take into consideration all of the NDCs that were updated in December, as well as hopefully that are announced at this summit. We have also seen action from China as well. So last year, a very significant announcement from President Xi announcing a 2060 carbon neutrality goal from China, which we estimated could lower end-of-century warming by 0.2 to 0.3 degrees, so a very significant announcement out of China. We also heard in December them announce a stronger target than the NDC that is currently submitted. They have not yet officially submitted an NDC update, but our assessment of at least that announcement still, while it is a stronger target, is still not sufficient to put them on a path to 1.5 degrees. So we would hope and anticipate that China would submit a stronger target in line with its carbon neutrality goal over the course of this year. And so the last thing that I just wanted to leave you with, we've sort of very briefly covered where we are in terms of the NDC submissions. What does that mean for us in terms of temperature warming? The last piece, which John also briefly touched on in his remarks, is the net zero targets. And we really have, there was the Chinese announcement in September was really part of a wave of announcements that we saw last year. And so by our count, there were close to 130 countries that had either announced or were considering targets. This covers about close to 2/3 of global emissions. And when you actually look at what would that mean, we reran our assessment to figure out what would that mean in terms of end-of-century warming, and it could limit warming to 2.1 degrees. So that is really, those targets that are on the table is really putting the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree temperature limit within striking distance. And so I think that's a very sort of positive sign and positive development. But the one thing that I really sort of, the message that I wanted to leave with you today is that, you know, some of my remarks I think were, you know, it's not a rosy picture of where things stand. Clearly, we've got a lot of countries that still need to submit. We have the warming, the trajectories that we're on at the moment are really not going to limit going to get us to that Paris degree target. But what I really wanted to leave you with was really everything is into play. Everything is to play for in Glasgow. The temperature drop that we saw with these net zero targets of getting us to 2.1 degrees was the biggest drop, or one of the biggest drops we've seen in the entire history of the tracker. And we've been doing this for more than 10 years. So that was really positive. But to get there, you need the NDCs, you need the targets in 2030, and you really need to close that gap. And so with that, I will leave it there. Back to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Claire, for that amazing brief, especially with regards to the where and what it means for us to submit our NDCs. I think the first half of our panel discussion was looking at a very international perspective. John gave us a very great overview of what the UK and how they plan to make it an equal and just process. And Claire really got into the nitty-gritties of how to submit and to make sure your submission is adequate. Now I would like us to move into the local perspective. And so we as South Africa are yet to submit our revised NDC. and currently we're completing the drafting of the revised NDC. So what are some of the highlights? Specifically, the areas where we can demonstrate a raised ambition. Similarly, what are the challenges and dynamics involved in formulating an ambitious NDC? And lastly, what lies ahead between now and the submission of our NDC? To help us unpack this and answer this, it's Mr. Mkhuthazi. He is the director under the Chief Directorate at the International Climate Change Relations and Reporting. His responsibility includes coordinating South Africa's position on Article 6 on the Paris Agreement. I mean, guys, this is intense. And negotiation thereof. With regards to the negotiations on carbon markets, his role includes providing support in negotiations under International Civil Aviation Organization and also International Maritime Organization. In addition, he covers an analysis of implementation-related decision following from the COP and facilitates implementation terms of research and stakeholder consultation in the development of South Africa's NDC, including the update that South Africa is currently working on. Mr. Mkhuthazi, your bio is endless. We hope that today you can help us answer these questions as to what lies ahead between now and our submission of our NDC. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity, and thanks to the colleagues who made the prior presentations. I think they provide a fair, preface of the context in terms of how this process has evolved and where are we in terms of the stock, of the collective NDCs globally. As South Africa, we did submit the first NDC following from the Paris Agreement in 2016. Paris Agreement was concluded in 2015 in terms of its negotiation, but the NDC started flowing upon ratification thereof. And we had the opportunity, to submit, our NDC, which we believe is an ambitious one. In terms of the key preliminary aspects that one would prefer to
Sorry, Mr. Mkhuthazi, we just lost you there for a minute. I'm going to give you a minute just to reconnect, and then I might just have to bring in our next speaker while we sort out our network issues. So while we're waiting for Mr. Mkhuthazi to respond, we've had a very interesting two panelists coming in internationally, and it would be great for you as an audience to pose your questions at our chats and help us really address some of the questions that we may have into the NDC submission as Claire indicated, as well as what does it mean internationally for all of us. So I think we've actually lost Mr. Mkhuthazi, and we'll go back to him. So in the meantime, while we are looking for Mr. Mkhuthazi to rejoin, I would like to introduce the most important, my biggest passion, the civil society voice in the submission. So we have a representative, from Greenpeace, and we're looking at to say, what has Greenpeace undertaken as a technical analysis of South Africa's NDC with the view of the development of more ambitious targets in line with what is required by science? What are the findings of the work that the Greenpeace has done, and how can we implement these kind of findings? And to do this, it's Thandile. Thandile is a climate and energy campaigner for Greenpeace Africa. She has driven into the climate and environment sphere by desire to ensure environmental regulatory compliance. So she has this passion from her coming within. She writes in her own capacity on topics including public health, energy access, and climate adaptation. She aspires to amplify the message of climate emergency and influence state actors to prioritize the climate. Thandile, welcome. Thank you for being here today. Please, can you let us know what can civil society do, and how much voice do we have, and how do we amplify our voices in this kind of reports? Thanks. Good morning to all the attendees, and thank you for having me, Ndoni. So speaking on behalf of Greenpeace Africa and our role in civil society, it is very important that us, as well as the other members of civil society, submit responses to the draft NDC and ensure that the voices of South Africans and their needs are heard in this submission, and that they strengthen the targets put forward. So frankly speaking, Greenpeace is disappointed by the submissions that have been made by the DFFE. To put it frankly, they're embarrassing. But the contribution that our government has put forward is not a new commitment. It is simply refurbishing the previous commitments that were made. And as you heard during Claire's insightful presentation, South Africa's updated commitments are still considered insufficient by the Climate Action Tracker. So for these contributions to be considered decent, the DFFE needs to strengthen these commitments. It seemed even by their own reckoning that these were not ambitious commitments. They cited the national circumstances as well as our COVID-19 pandemic as reasons for why this was the highest possible ambition that they could submit. And it's important that as civil society, we encourage them and that DEF acts on it to build back better from what has actually occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic. Fossil fuel industry has exacerbated the social inequalities and financial inequalities over the years through damaging health and well-being in these areas. So it's important that we build back better in a way that is more socially equitable to the rest of South Africa. And the way that we can do this, or rather the way that DFFE can do this, is through aggressively scaling up renewable energy in the electricity sector by 2030, and no longer building any new coal-fired power plants or granting licenses to coal mines that especially do not meet the requirements for the climate, assessing the climate impacts. So as mentioned, DFFE needs to make the case for increased uptake of renewables. Right now, as it stands, South Africa has not exhausted our renewable energy potential, and the IRP simply uses it as a mechanism to to widen our energy mix or diversify our energy mix. But the DFFE needs to make certain and campaign for the inclusion of renewable energies, not simply as a diversification method, but rather as a pivotal part of creating or aligning to the climate and the Paris Agreement that we have signed up to. So it's absolutely essential that we include renewable energies in a way that is to serve as the base load rather than simply ensuring energy access in a more diversified manner. So we need for the government to also strengthen our regulations surrounding climate action and the requirements to do so from our corporate actors. Carbon majors such as Sasol and Eskom will not feel inclined to make these commitments unless they're required to do so by law. And so this is the government that has claimed to be acting quite tough and no longer approaching the issues with Sasol and Eskom with leniency. But at the same time, when it comes to action, verbally they will verbalize this, but in terms of action, they're not acting the way that they need to. This was demonstrated with their approach to air quality. So if our government is acting as it is with air quality, with leniency against these carbon majors, how can we truly expect them to approach climate change with the same with vigor and decisive action when they fail to do so with air quality? Issues such as the reduction of the minimum emission standards or the weakening of the minimum emission standards last year is a demonstration of how DEF is acting with impunity towards these carbon majors. And essentially, the air quality they're responsible for is the same source for the climate emissions. And so we should be acting with impunity against them, in increasing monitoring and evaluation for better enforcement, and just improving those commitments that we've made and demonstrating their commitments to the South Africans through these actions. So the trajectory that has been put forward by our government, as I mentioned, is not new. It simply refurbishes the old ambitions that were set
forward. And the proposed plan simply waits for our emissions to plateau. So South Africa needs to be more ambitious about this and ensure that with every year we are actively working to reducing our emissions. So Greenpeace will be making a submission as well with Sacan, and it's very important that when we put forward our ambitions, that we put very stringent ones forward. And so Greenpeace Africa's research has revealed that for South Africa to be aligned with the Paris Agreement and to close the emissions gap, we need to submit a commitment that is that indicates what is required by science, and that would be something that's more in line with 288 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that would be a massive reduction from what DFFE has actually proposed right now. And what's important for us to remember is that this government, DFFE, the administration, has failed to act decisively on air pollution, as we mentioned. This is the department that has granted licenses to carbon majors. They have they've continued to claim that they are tough on carbon majors while also weakening the minimum emission standards. They have granted emission licenses and mining licenses for projects that do not sufficiently capture what the impacts might be on climate change, which ultimately resulted in litigation against them. So we need to definitely put pressure on DFFE as civil society to act decisively and coordinate well with our Department of Mineral and Energy and Mineral Resources in a manner that is aligned to what is set out in the Paris Agreement, instead of working in contradiction of each other. So the Department of Energy needs to understand that the uptake of renewable energy is absolutely necessary for the reduction in emissions. And they also need to understand that the procurement of fossil fuels, such as we see with the Power Ship project right now, for which could secure tenure for 20 years, is not at all in alignment with what this NDC has proposed, let alone what is required by science. And it's important that they coordinate and make sure that they put forward something that is actually plausible. It's also saddening that our NDC is so reliant on weak mechanisms such as the carbon tax, as we mentioned, which had already been put forward. This market mechanism has proved not to be effective in actually curbing behavior and mitigating emissions. Similarly, if you consider yourself as an attendee, as a consumer, when you go to the shopping centers, over the last 2 decades, we've had a plastic levy, but has that really curbed your approach towards purchasing plastics? And it's the same way with these carbon majors, because they actually can afford, and especially at the current rates, they can afford to pay that carbon tax, and they would rather do that than really mitigating or changing their behaviors. So we need to understand that we cannot rely on these market mechanisms, and we need stronger commitments that can actually result in definitive change. Also, the fact that during the COVID-19 pandemic, or rather the lockdown restrictions, essentially carbon tax has been suspended for the financial year of 2020 and 2021 indefinitely. So it's very important that our department really take a look at this, go back to the drawing board, and ensure that what they bring back to us is more decisive and more aligned to what is required by science. And our government has an opportunity here, despite what has happened with the COVID-19 pandemic, to build back better in a more equitable way, socially equitable way for South Africans. And as DFFE, they need to consider what they owe to South Africans that are experiencing climate change and will continue to experience it through droughts and extreme weather events, as witnessed earlier this year with Cyclone Eloise. And we also need to consider understanding that climate change is a transboundary issue, what it is that we owe to our neighbors who are experiencing climate change tenfold or even disproportionately more than we are. So just in closing, Greenpeace Africa is not satisfied with this commitment. It is an embarrassment, and our government needs to put forward more decisive action on this NDC. Thank you.
Sure, Thandile, you are out here to make a statement for the society. I don't know, I think the technical glitch was actually quite good, because now we can really ask you, Mr. Mkhuthazi, what must we do? You know, what must happen? And she's basically saying that we are not doing enough. All that we have on paper on NDC, what the government is saying that is being done is not being done. And so let's move away from the words and let's get into the practicality of actually what we say with our words and policy. So, Mr. Mkhuthazi, I think you are online now. Please give us your response on what Thandile just said. And most importantly, maybe just give us a foundation on how we actually plan to do our submission. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you so much, and apologies for the glitch. It was unexpected. I think I missed an opportunity here to... Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I missed an opportunity to first outline, you know, what the current NDC and how it is different, you know, from the previous. When I broke off, I merely had covered the issue of its structural formation or composition, to say that because it articulates, you know, ambition, therefore it carries all the necessary components such as mitigation, adaptation, as well as support. But there's also a strong requirement from Paris that parties shall account and then they shall report, you know, against their nationally determined contribution. That is these commitments. And it's important, therefore, that we also take note of the fact that this process has evolved, you know, over time under the convention. You would recall that following from Copenhagen, we had a target or a pledge, let me put it that way. It was a pledge, it was not a binding target, but it was a target that was below business as usual, you know, kind of a trajectory, right? But when we got to Paris, we made a progress as South Africa, even before Paris could pronounce, and even before parties could agree amongst themselves that there should be a progression made on the part of each party that makes a commitment, that there should be no backsliding. But already in Paris, the NDC that we submitted in 2016, we did away with the below business as usual kind of a trajectory. We came up with a limit to our emissions over, you know, the period to 2030. And we took that from the PPD, where our emissions now had to be limited, and we're plateauing up to 20, you know, 30, if you like, with a limit of 614 megatons of CO2 emissions. So that reference is important to depict, you know, the progression that we have made, you know, over a period of time. And this is an economy-wide kind of a, you know, target, in that the entire economy has to carry this. But now, what is the breakaway in terms of the proposed draft that we are consulting on at the moment? The difference in terms of that draft is that for 2025, we now are saying we will be reducing, you know, our emissions, that is on the mitigation side, we'll be reducing our emissions by 17%, right, to 510 megatons of CO2. That is significant. And that is not enough, because in 2030, we say this should be totaling a 28% reduction relative to the previous 614 megatons. Now, your economic sectors and other sectors within your economy, if they are to carry that, you know, it means they need to engage on a strong drive in terms of technologies and revision of processes, depending on which sector, that will enable them to transform and be able to meet that particular target. So that is very important. Yes, I do agree with the colleagues as they have intimated earlier that there's been COVID challenges. Yes, it has affected, you know, all countries the world over, and we are no exception to this. And because these emissions are pro-cyclical, you know, to the level of growth of the economy, when the economy is down, the emissions also go down. So there's another challenge now of us having to recover as an economy at the same time. And like I indicated at opening before I broke off, that we are a developing country and that there are considerations of equity. And the references to the climate action tracker, if I may make an example. Yes, we may be against the assessment by climate action tracker, not be viewed, but we also have tested these targets against the climate equity reference framework. There is a climate equity reference calculator that we have applied, which South Africa prefers to use it because it takes into account issues of historical responsibility. That as a developing country, we are the ones that have least contributed to the problem in terms of emissions over time. And therefore, it's necessary that we make, a transitional, kind of a change over time, making sure that we do not compromise some of the key sectors of our economy. For instance, looking at our economic structure, largely dominated by either mining as well as, the kind of energy that we are using, fossil fuel intensive. We are not able to simply switch off like that over time, because now you need to juxtapose aspects of just transition amongst others. What are you going to do with the jobs, the unemployment? We already have high unemployment. So this is where we say we do need the kind of support, from the global partners. And there are uncertainties in that regard, because if you look at the global, economy or the international finance side, or even capital markets for that matter, they are constrained as well because of the COVID factor, because of the corresponding economic shock that accompanies COVID. We are uncertain as to the scale and the extent to which we are to get that support. So the commitment we make corresponds with the level of support that we anticipate. And we are not necessarily saying as South Africa that we will, this is a conditional commitment. We will await flows of support to come internationally before we can actually take action. No, we are to implement some of these initiatives based getting, allocation from the fiscus, but also from international support. Let me not dwell much on mitigation. Let me also just talk briefly on the adaptation side. The first presenter alluded to the issues of impacts that are already prevailing, which even the previous speaker has alluded to in terms of cyclones that are recent, that there are adaptation impacts and costs associated with that. And we require recognition, of these, costs that we incur from our fiscus as part of our contribution towards what we refer as the global goal on adaptation. Because once you have a mitigation goal, the view of developing countries, including South Africa, is that there also is a global goal on adaptation, and all these costs incurred should be somewhat recognized as part of our contribution towards that particular global goal. And we have 5 key goals, which I will not necessarily go into, but if you get the presentation, those are listed, on page 7. The key activities related to adaptation sectors, such as your agriculture, water, human settlements, health, and biodiversity, they will largely dwell on issues of how do we enhance, early warning system so that those sectors are not compromised, or the capabilities and capacities in those are not compromised. How do we deal with vulnerability and adaptation in those? How do we mainstream climate change adaptation, strengthening of institutional capacities, development of pipeline of adaptation projects are some of the initiatives. Let me, before I take a break, I don't know if my time is almost, exhausted, but the last point on... Come again?
Saying you can carry on.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Then the last point on support, in the draft updated NDC that we are putting out for consultations, you will come across a figure of $8 billion by the year 2030. That is an aggregate, figure that says that at least annually by 2030, we must be having that kind of a figure or an amount to be able to implement both mitigation and adaptation, initiatives. There's also support related to just transition. Will require international support in that regard. Will require debt, restructuring, because there's going to be stranded assets. When you have an economic structure, it's not easy or plausible to simply switch, like that from one kind of economic structure to the other. So in the process, we'll be hit with just transition. We are committed to making a change, to making a progression, to being ambitious, but for just transition, we will have to be, supported. Debt restructuring, infrastructure to support energy efficiency consideration, support and investments that will go towards, for instance, in the area of transport, green hydrogen in support of electric vehicles, public transport, but also we've got entities in our economy that we don't want them to be left behind, like your small, medium, micro enterprises that should partake within the energy service space. Energy service companies that are SMME, based should be some of those initiatives. The last point is to say, whilst this is on the mitigation side, whilst this is an economy-wide kind of target, we hinge on the key initiatives that are already approved partly. And these are the National Energy Efficiency Strategy, your Green Transport Strategy, your IRP, 2019 on the energy side, as well as carbon tax. Those are the 4 Trojan horses that we believe can be able to carry us through the targets that we are making. To conclude, Chair, we are saying that we advocate for balance in this NDC. I also indicated the proportions that will make us make a difference over time. And I do agree to the last speaker when she said that the renewables drive is one of those initiatives. That is part of what is captured in this NDC. It carries, those kinds of thoughts and suggestions. It is not a perfect piece, but it will enable us, to solicit and gather views, from a number of stakeholders in South Africa and elsewhere. Let me take a pause there. I may not be able to say all that I would have preferred. Hopefully the questions will lead one to say additional points. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mkhuthazi. Thank you for coming in. Thank you for covering the questions. Thank you to all the panelists for coming in today and really giving us a really great global and local perspective of what's going on. So just to summarize, we really were looking at we started with the global perspective around the NDC and what it means for COP26, the UK government. And then Claire went on to touch on to the details of our submission. Then we moved on to Thandile, who spoke about the civil society and what it means for Greenpeace and the lack of implementation, rather, when it comes to this kind of policy and reducing our emissions as a country. And Mr. Mkhuthazi really went into the details and spoke about how we still are a developing country. Our emissions are not at the largest. And so this might mean that we need to have a broader conversation on what it means for us and in the submission. I want us to go back into the core question of this webinar, and is South Africa ambitious enough? And so I really want to get a good understanding around the international perspective. And I think, John, you're an incredible person to help us understand from the UK perspective, from the COP26 perspective, how was the South African NDC submission, in terms of the COP? And what are the perspectives, in question? So just give us a good overview of this NDC, South Africa, and the COP26.
Ndoni, thank you very much indeed. And a huge thank you to the previous speakers who set it out so very clearly. And Mr. Mkhuthazi, I hear your passion, and I fully support a number of things that you made very clear, which is that as an emerging economy, the issues of just transition, the issues of recognizing fairness and inclusivity are absolutely right. And we must never lose sight of that. And that's very core to us as the COP26 president. I think what we've heard from this is just how complicated this process is of understanding what an economy-wide shift looks like. I think I've lost. Am I still heard?
I can still hear you.
Yes,
you
can still hear you. Yes.
Okay, then let me carry on. I've gone a blackened screen, but that's fine. I'll keep on going. How complex this is about putting together this an economy-wide piece. So you asked me what would our response be? Well, I mean, first of all, this is still in deliberation, and that's very much a South African product. Based on what Claire set out quite clearly, and I said right at the start, which is that everything Mr. Mkhuthazi said about the threat and the risk of ambition and the cost of adaptation is absolutely correct. But if we don't get mitigation right, that cost is going to skyrocket and increase, and we need to get that right. So mitigation is really important. And from an objective perspective, the level that has been set out, as Claire set out, doesn't bring it into the Paris below 2 degrees set out. It is above that. But I think the couple of things I want to point out. One is we recognize there is ambition in the bringing the upper range down. That is clearly a step in the right direction, and setting an absolute ceiling at 440 demonstrates the fact that South Africa recognizes it wants to go back to this process. I think where we would encourage and support and try and sort of advocate for is looking at the bottom end of the range. And again, in Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment Defence, they've made it very clear that they have set out an NDC that emissions that is practical, they can deliver on with existing policies. And what we've seen in the UK is policies will constantly change if we have the right long-term vision. And therefore, setting a 440 as the upper limit is understandable, but where is that ambition, that striving at the bottom end, which stays at a level which, as Claire set out, is still above the 2 degree target. But I think what's so important about this kind of event, and what's so important about the sort of points that Thandile made, is this is a South African process. And I think what we would encourage is the South African public to get right behind Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, and help them by responding and setting out what is your vision for where you want South Africa to be in 20, 30, 40 years' time. What is clear is that the low carbon global economic transition is taking place at pace and is accelerating. It's accelerating across the major economies, and there are emerging economies that is taking place at pace. India, where 40% of South Africa's coal goes to, has committed to 450 gigawatts of solar power by the end of this decade. They're not going to need as much coal coming forward, and that's real passion and real ambition. So I think what I would encourage is this kind of process. Department of Forestry, Fish and Energy has a mandate, but it is one part of a government process. And as they point out, this is what was cleared by government, by cabinet, and therefore getting it together so that the energy story meets the aspirations they want in its entirety is a challenging, difficult issue. And I think the point that I think the minister made in launching this is that we want to hear from you. And at the moment, the targets that have set are not set in stone, but have been put out for public comment. So again, I think the challenge that, objectively, we would welcome if South Africa came to COP26 with a bit more ambition, certainly in the bottom end, demonstrate that, but also use that as an opportunity to showcase to the world at COP26 that you want to attract the investment that is needed to drive the economy, that you want to make sure that the businesses in this country are compatible and they are competitive with the global low carbon economy. That is happening outside, whether South Africa likes it or not. It's happening very quickly. And so objectively, I've answered that question. More broadly, I really understand what Mr. Mkhuthazi said about the challenge. And I think this is where this kind of debate is really important, in hoping that what comes out in front of the COP26 builds on what already has demonstrated some additional ambition. And there's a lot to be very proud about in terms of the creation of the Presidential Commission that's going to set a long-term vision, which we think is utterly important in terms of getting to where you are. So I think for us, we recognize the ambition that has been added to it, but that ambition of 28% is from the previous absolute upper level. The reality is South Africa's emission profile is about 510 megatons at the moment, or was just pre-COVID. And therefore, let's have a look at how much of a reduction is from that level and what more can be done. And I'd encourage all of you to help DFFE in terms of building that case they can take to cabinet and then take forward to COP26. I think I'll stop there, if that's okay.
Thank you so much. John, that is incredible. It really is. It talks about how we need to have more ambition, how we need to focus more on the bottom-up approach and understanding what it means for us as a country. Thank you for that co-perspective and some advice in that, Mr. Mkhuthazi really spoke about it is a challenge. It is about finding the balance. And how do we find that balance in such a, as a developing country? And so, Claire, can you provide any more tips as we draw to the submission of our NPC? From your perspective, how do we increase that ambition? How do we, stand out as a country so that it's not just words and not linking into the ground?
Actually, maybe before I get to that, I was wondering if I could answer, there's been some questions in the chat specifically to the Climate Action Tracker about the differences maybe in our rating system and how we take on negative emissions. And then I would get to that question. So if I take a step back and how do we assess the targets and when we say something is insufficient or it's 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, what does that mean? Well, our system is based on the concept of fairness. So what would be a fair contribution to reaching 1.5 degrees? And there are other, the concept of fairness is quite, it's definitely a contested contest. People don't agree on which metric. Is it more historic responsibility? Is it the capacity to act? Is it a variety of those? And so we at the Climate Action Tracker don't take a particular view. Instead, what we do is we take all of the literature that's out there that looks at how would you divide up what would be a fair contribution to meeting 1.5, and we come up with a range, and that is the country's fair share range that we have in our system. Now, unfortunately, because there is all of these different perspectives and things like that, that can be quite a broad range, which means if we let all of the countries at the very top of their fair share range do what they, do that, we would not actually limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So what we do is after we develop from this literature the fairness range, we then divide it into 3 categories. And the bottom end we think would be if everyone was in that area of their range, then that would be compatible with a 1.5 degree world. The middle is if everyone was in that portion of their fair share range, it would be compatible with 2 degrees. And then at the top end is the remainder, and that's what we call insufficient. So that's where the new South African draft NDC would fall as the upper end of that fair share range. And so the difference there was a couple of questions in the chat, and then also Mr. Mkhuthazi mentioned that they prefer a different framework, and so there are other frameworks out there that would give you different responses for South Africa. But again, those are probably going to select 1 or 2 different equity principles of how to share it. And what we've really tried to do is look at let's take all of the perspectives out there, create a range, and figure out where within that range would you need to be 1.5 degree compatible. So that's where we're coming from when we say the current draft that South Africa has put on the table is insufficient and would need to be strengthened. Of course, at the bottom end, the bottom end of that range is 2 degree compatible. So if they were to move to that lower end and beyond, they're getting 2 degrees and then very close to 1.5. The second question that was, I think, put to me in the chat was just on our use of negative emissions. So the way we estimate emissions to the end of century. If you go to our website, we have interactive graphs for all the countries that we track, and so you can look at what are our estimates in terms of current policies that the countries have in place, and where does that get them in terms of emissions until 2030. So we have that data, which is all publicly available, and you can download it off of our website, and then we extend that out to 2100 to figure out how much warming there would be. And there we rely on the database that's associated with the IPCC SR5 report, which would include negative emissions, though we do filter that for some of the scenarios. Some of those emissions pathways can have quite extensive negative emissions, so we filtered that out and really limited the amount of negative emissions that countries could have. So I think that's hopefully that answers the technical question. The one other sort of just point that I would make on there, in the analysis that we did on the net zero targets, this 2.1 degree estimate that we figured that about the 130 net zero targets that are out there, what would that do in terms of warming? There, we made a very conservative estimate that rather than going negative, we would just have zero emissions till the end of century. So hopefully that takes care of technicalities. In terms of the question that I was asked, I really, I think a lot of the comments that I would make have sort of already been said, that, you know, shifting away from coal, expanding the renewable energy, ensuring that there's a just transition to make that energy transition happen. I think we need to sort of see the phase out of coal globally by 2040, and so we have sort of the cost of renewables have been falling each year, and so that would I would say that would be a very sort of one of the key elements that we would see in the energy sector. I think I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Claire, for clarifying that. I just wanted to get more perspective from Thandile about, you know, your statement about what Mr. Mkhuthazi just spoke about, the fact that we are emitting not, you know, half of the amount that is being emitted globally. What does that mean for us in terms of prioritizing energy, and what does it mean for the civil society?
Well, thank you. Well, our position remains the same. You know, South Africa, you'll often heard is a tale of two economies, and that being the wealthy and the poor. And I think we're quite selective about when we want to identify as which. And the reality is that many companies in South Africa have amassed immeasurable wealth when it comes to the fossil fuel industry, and still it has, as I mentioned in the presentation, exacerbated the social inequalities that we have. And so his statement speaks to how we certainly need to continue to upscale renewable energy. And it's our opinion that it remains that in order for us to actually approach the targets that have been set out by the Paris Agreement and to commit to what is required by science, we need to make these commitments.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Thandile. There is a question here for you, Mr. Mkhuthazi. I think, you know, a lot of people have a lot of questions around the government, as well as, you know, it's almost like people are feeling a bit, you know, there's a contradiction, but we completely understand that it's not about a contradiction. It's actually about the challenges that we have to actually play around. And so there's a question here from Alex saying, how can the government claim that they're committed to renewable energy while uncritically enshrining an energy plan which constrains renewable energy and forces a new uneconomical coal and lots of fossil fuels? Do you have a response to that statement?
Hello. Well, thanks for the question. The Department of Fisheries, Forestry and the Environment, that's our new name now. And Excellency John Wade-Smith stated that very clearly. Thanks. Yeah, in our case, we work with partner departments. As you may have noted, the key policy interventions and programs that I alluded to, which I said will carry us in terms of the mitigation target that I referred to earlier. We co-partner with other departments. For instance, detailed energy, issues and interventions, they remain within the scope and mandate of DMRE, Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, if I'm not mistaken. So I may not be able to speak to the T in terms of the actual energy policy, but what I can talk to are the core benefits that we derive from energy transition, in terms of the energy mix, that if we adopt more renewables, as what is currently happening in terms of our government under the RIP program, but also now the latest, bid window 5, soliciting bids, for more renewables. We are in support of that. And the other aspect in responding to that question lies in the fact that we advocate largely, because we work with partner departments and sector departments that carry the mandates. We rather moot for policy mainstreaming, that they take into consideration all these imperatives, like these targets or climate change, considerations in their policy making. So I'll be that general in terms of responding to that, because the question is also too broad. I will not be able to satisfy it to the T. May I also take the opportunity, Chair, to respond to one or two more other issues, yes, if I may? Yes, the further pressing of the lower bound of the then PPD, or even the currently proposed, target, mitigation target. This is like Excellency Wade, indicated. This is a consulting document. It's a proposed target. We are open to the views, and hence the minister strongly encouraged us, to go out, strongly encouraged, the South African public to partake in this. So I cannot push back and say no, but I'm happy that we did outline the key principles that we are a developing country and we need to balance aspects of just transition. We are open to proposals. So Thandile, when you are to make your representation, you feel free to do so. And then the other aspects had to do with implementation. I would just like to allude to some of the implementation related work that the department is doing. For instance, in the pipeline, you have your climate, change bill, which will culminate into an act, upon the relevant processes having been satisfied. That act is going to compel, entities to report more, to stick more to their, targets and allocated targets. There's also work on carbon budgets that the department is, so it's an incremental, space, this one of climate. There's going to be work which also has been referenced in the current proposed NDC on sector emissions target. And now the work that will be done by the Presidential Committee on Climate, the P4C that the ambassador alluded to earlier, is going to be advising government in terms of how it can make sure that it does more of this, implementation. So on implementation, it may not be perfect, but there's work taking place. You also may have heard of some of the flagship initiatives like your low emissions development strategies, which was submitted last year to the UNFCCC, where South Africa articulates an aspirational, goal of net zero by 2050. But that one is still aspirational. We still need to do more work in terms of what pathways leading to that will require in terms of resourcing and all of that. But that point talks to the element of ambition as well. The same applies with adaptation, with your national climate change adaptation strategy, which is incorporated in terms of some of its key objectives. It has got 9 objectives that have been incorporated into the current draft. I thought let me just talk briefly to those whilst I respond to the original question. Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mkhuthazi. John, you know, there is a question here that's talking about a just transition. You spoke about how you want to prioritize, as a British High Commission, you know, equality and justness into this, especially in Africa. What does this mean? You know, what does this mean for our country, and what does it mean in us explaining this and writing it down in our NDC?
I think I'm there. You are. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Look, I think it's. I think what's really important is that if you actually look at the language that we as COP President have been using since the start of our, since the point at the beginning of last year that we took over the presidency designate. We don't actually become president until COP in Glasgow. The issue of just and fairness has become an increasingly strong narrative in our what we're saying. And I think, you know, that's really important. And so things like, you know, when we're looking at what needs to be done, we would never look at it through the blunt instrument of just close down coal right now. You need to move because there's an impact. There's an impact. And how not we UK, but how the international community engage with South Africa. And we provide opportunity for conversations with South Africa about what support can be needed in order to make sure that a transition is just and fair. So that's really important. But there's another thing I think is really important is that I think there's a question I think Bernie put, or statement Bernie put in the thing about the fact that you know, a lot of coal is exported through Richards Bay, which has an impact on jobs there. You know, that is the case, but it's not the case for much longer because the markets for coal will over the next 5, 10, 15 years start to diminish. You're looking at Eskom right now, and you know it's got 4 power stations that are literally on their last legs and are going to be closed. So I think what we would say is another way of looking at just transition is rather than hold back advancement because we're trying to work at what we do with these communities, is that we need to look at that at the same time as accelerating and setting out a vision, because it's not about supporting and saving purely what do you do with 100,000 people in the coal industry and the people around them, but it's actually how does South Africa create 500, 600, 700,000 jobs a year to address the inequality and the unemployment that exists right now. And so, you know, it's not binary. It's not that, you know, you need to stop today and move into something different, but actually start accelerating. So on the renewable energy factor here, South Africa needs energy security. Getting to Mr. Mkhuthazi's point about the importance of SMMEs. SMMEs are absolutely the lifeblood of South Africa's new economy, but they need, and they are most affected by the issues around energy insecurity. So there's a real opportunity to plug that gap now with renewable energy at scale, and has been for a few years. So, and get that building up and start to build the new economy, start to build the new jobs. It's about the construction, it's the manufacturing parts. People will invest and see South Africa not as just developing the parts and the technology for South Africa, but being the leader in exporting into Southern Africa, where all the same things apply about the need to be relying on renewable energy and stuff like that. So I think that what we'd say is we fully understand just, but don't let just be a brake on progress. Look at them in the round and actually recognize that there is real scope to start shifting and change the economy and creating the new jobs that will hopefully suck up the jobs of the future that start to go from those industries that, whether we like it or not, are going to be suffering. You know, the coal industry is a sunset industry globally, and therefore, you know, let's start to build that new economy now, to start creating those new roles right now. And that's, I think, where we're very keen, is to understand that you don't force change in a way that has a massive detrimental impact on people, but you try and encourage change at a pace that provides new opportunities, new growth opportunities, and ensures that South Africa remains a viable and attractive proposition for international investment, which is increasingly driven by sustainable investment and green investment. They want to go to places where there is absolute clarity that their money is invested in a country in the direction of sustainability and long-term through global security, and also in terms of the whole trading environment. So again, my point is this is, and as Mr. Mkhuthazi has said as well, it's a great opportunity for the South African public to feed into this NDC process and help shape what they want to see as the future South Africa. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, John, for answering that. I want to pose a question to the panel. This will be the last one. Kaylin asked a question that, considering the draft updated NDC, why was the lower bound of the emissions target corridor not adjusted compared with the first NDC? I don't know who can answer that question from our panel.
Maybe I can give it a first go on that, because may I?
Yes, please.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's more of a reference case, if I may say. From Paris, we are expected to make progression and reach the highest possible ambition. And the best way, or the initial way, the best way to initiate it is to be able to show your progression, at least in terms of lowering, your emissions from the top. And the reason why we could not pursue the lowering of the lower bound even further at 398 is because that requires further work, and
Sorry, Mr. Mkhuthazi, we lost you there for a minute. All right, so I'm gonna just wait for him to come back while Mr. Mkhuthazi is getting his network together. Thandile, there's a question here that says, what is Greenpeace Africa's proposed emission trajectory from its own research?
So Greenpeace Africa has proposed a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions to an upper range of 288 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And we believe that striving for this reduction in emissions would be in line with what is required by science. And it would also position South Africa as the leaders on the continent in terms of climate action and reduction, as they aspire to be stated in their response. So I think that's the best option that they should be putting forward. And we will be submitting that in the response to the draft NDC. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thandile. Mr. Mkhuthazi, you were explaining on the question that was
sorry for that.
You can continue.
May I continue?
Yes, please continue. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Apologies for that once more. What I'm saying is that there was outstanding research which we believed could be carried when we do the net zero pathways and the resourcing that would be required in that regard. But at the same time, we are open to the proposals if stakeholders have done some research, which we may have to consider and make an evaluation of whether it's necessary to do so. But to close this point, from my view, from that upper bound, we believe we have made progression compared to where we were. And over time, we are steering towards the highest possible, ambition in terms of our emissions target. Thank you. I can't hear now.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you so much. I mean, I only did it once, so, that's very good. Thank you so much to everyone for coming today. I'm going to wrap up our session now, and I would like to hear from Claire. Claire, what are the, your last words, your recommendations to South Africa, to the department, as we draw near our submission for the NDC, as well as, that bottom-up approach and the top-down approach? How do we find that balance even be it developing countries versus developed countries? How do we find that balance as we close the session?
Thank you. I would have to say I'm very encouraged to hear that lower bound, there would be flexibility for that lower bound to go even further. I think if we look at our analysis that we've done so far, we think that the current policies that South Africa has in place would actually put it on track to meet that lower bound. So we really do think that there is scope for going even further. So I think that's a very positive development. I think to the balance to all countries, I mean, we really do need to see more all countries step up and adopt more ambitious targets. I mean, we have been taking baby steps in closing the gap. The leap to the adoption of net zero was a sort of really big step forward, but until we have all countries coming forward with stronger targets and the policies to implement and meet those targets, we're not going to close that 2030 gap. And then the comment that I would just make, a couple of presenters have touched on it, is the impact of COVID. I mean, we have seen a sort of short-lived decrease in emissions in 2020, but that is not part of the structural change that we need. What we really need is the structural change of the economy to get to 1.5, and that's looking at all of the recovery packages and the stimulus and the policies going forward really needs to create that a green recovery and a shift to a zero carbon future. And thank you very much for having me this morning. And I would encourage everyone that is listening is to submit those comments. And if we have a lot of material on South Africa up on our website, and I would encourage you to reference that in thinking through how you're going to make your comments on the NDC, because at the end of the day, it's your country's NDC. But thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much. I would like to go on to Thandile. From your presentation, you drew a lot of passion for civil society, for the frustration of the lack of implementation. Can you conclude, your last statement as to what they can do, what the government can do, what South Africa can do in making sure that we actually don't have, this kind of frustration once again coming from civil society?
Well, I would implore, as mentioned in the presentation, that DFFE take consideration and heed of what South Africa is requesting and the climate anxiety that we all feel, and take that and produce a document that we can be proud of and put forward to the international community as South Africa's contribution to the climate crisis, that we are just as concerned about it and have a desire to protect not only ourselves, but our future generations. And I implore the public, anyone who is interested in this topic, to engage with civil society on these issues. Write to your ministers to implore them to take action on it and express your frustration so that they can truly understand what is required and what you feel you need to see as an individual as action take place. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Mkhuthazi, there is a question for you that a persistent, active person who is an attendee to our conference really wants the answer for this. And the question is, they're coming from Conservation South Africa, and they're asking the targets for the land use sector. They would appreciate an answer on whether the government will raise the ambition and set target for emission reduction from improved land management practices, for example, grassland, savannas, and etc.
Okay. Thanks. Yes, the target that is proposed there is inclusive of things, so to speak. The only exception is only in relation to natural disasters. When you look into our NDC, I can't recall now the exact page. We have indicated that with the natural disasters, then that may have implications, for the variance, in the target itself. there's a lot of work taking place there as well domestically in terms of REDD+, focusing on reforestation, issues and all. So on the implementation side, there's work taking place in terms of forest reference levels and how those can be enhanced to be able to take more, carbon stock and all of that. But if you perhaps have a detailed question, we can link you with our land sector, expert. But the target itself is inclusive of land, and then there's this caveat that for natural disasters, they will not be, the figure will not take into account, on that, and therefore there's still more work to be done. And then this bit on national implementation aspects in terms of what we are doing on REDD. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mkhuthazi, while you're here, can you please, give us some kind of way forward into, giving us certainty, giving us peace, giving us a way and motivation that this NDC submission will be different. It won't be the same. There's going to be, different goals, better for people and society. Your closing remarks, please.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for the opportunity to partake in this webinar, and thanks to the colleagues with whom I have shared the platform and reflected on various issues. What I can say here as my agenda is what the minister had indicated, inviting, participants, stakeholders to participate in the stakeholder consultations that we are starting this month. That will run up until the end of May. And then in June, we are to consider the inputs for incorporation into what is to be a revised, updated draft, which will then put through the cluster system within government. And then it will be tabled in cabinet by the third quarter of the current year. That means by September, that must have been tabled to cabinet. But the intention is that we submit before, as early as possible, before COP26. That is to be held, later on in the year. So this will be a better NDC because we hope that it will be owned by South Africans across sectors, across the spectrum, of our society, as the case has been actually even with the previous one. Because we also consulted extensively where we had direct, interface meetings. But this time around, we will be blending the platforms where we have direct, but also virtual, kind of platforms. I think I'll share a link, or I'm not sure if it's in that presentation. I'll share a link that leads to the web page on the latest of where we are in terms of the stakeholder consultation, because the web page within our website at DERCO, or a web page for NDC specifically, it seeks to update. You get the document there, but you also can get an email where you forward your inputs. All these good inputs that Abo Thandile and other colleagues have come up with, they can send through that email so that we have a solid database of those inputs. I think I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming in today, for giving us some good points. I hope the question was answered. If not, do fill in your inputs to the link that Mr. Mkhuthazi is going to provide, and get your voice out there and get your mind out there into this kind of decision making. The last and not least person I would really like to ask for the closing remarks is Mr. John Wade Smith, who really spoke about how the UK has to lead by example. And so what are your closing remarks into, our SA and SA NDC submission and the role in which international players can actually make in making sure that this is just and fair?
So thanks very much indeed, and I'll keep this incredibly short. I mean, one, I'd like to sort of thank through Mr. Mkhuthazi the DFFE for actually driving this process so that before COP26 there will be a new NDC, because that's highly important. And I do understand that in South Africa that there is a very strong history of all policies being very much consultative documentations. And so where we've been able to be so progressive in the UK in terms of our ambition is because we had a very clear government vision about what we need to be, but we then looked for and got the support from business and civil society, particularly business, who said, we understand where you're going, give us clarity and we'll follow, because that's what we need policy certainty. So this process of speaking to the public of South Africa is hugely important for DFFE. And so, we look forward to the department being able to channel everything that's been commented on, bring it together, and then take it to Parliament, take it to Cabinet, because that's where the fight will be in terms of making sure that the other departments support it as well, because there's only so much the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment can do on their own. So get those comments in, and we look forward to and we welcome hopefully what will be an improved NDC on the one that's currently in draft right now. And I thank everyone for their time and being part of this wonderful discussion.
Thank you so much to everyone who came today to engage with us on this very important conversation on the NDC, and is South Africa ambitious enough? I think from the gist of what the panel has said, we need to raise our ambitions. We need to build stronger in making sure that we implement all these ambitions and these goals that we write down in our NDC. And this panel today really summarized it so perfectly from an international perspective as to what we need to do, and going into South Africa as to what South Africa is doing currently to make sure that these ambitions and that the NDC is fair and just. And then we went into even a deeper conversation with Thandile, who really emphasized the frustration, more than anything, the lack of implementation that maybe civil society feels currently. And so as we're moving into our NDC, the most important role that we want here today with Mail and Guardian, with Sacan, is that you make your voice. The whole point is climate action. So fill out your voices, fill out those forms, and let your opinions be heard by these kind of submissions. Most of the time, we're very quick at talking, but then when it comes to us making sure that the right people here, we don't do enough effort to that. So let us make sure that after this webinar, we make sure that our voices are heard in what we want changed, in what we want included, in the questions that we have to our government, to international societies, as well as to civil society. So thank you so much from my side to the panel. Thank you for the great discussion around how we actually can improve this. John spoke about how the UK needs to lead by example. Mr. Mkhuthazi really spoke about how the government is dealing with all of these challenges as a developing country. Thandile went into civil society and what are their voices as Greenpeace Africa. And Claire went into the details as to how they measure impact, how they measure these kind of goals and targets in the NDC. So thank you so much. We hope to hear from you again. Join us next time, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye and thanks.